Okay, it's 3:30. I guess we will get started. I'm Jason Grissom from Vanderbilt, and I am the chair of this Flash Talk session. So thanks for all of you coming. This is McCall Curlander's brainchild to try to get a different thing. And so there are going to be 9 presentations that are 5 minutes each. Okay, so prep yourself. We're going to be in this for the long haul. But before we get into the presentations, Doug Harris is going to say a little bit about the live handbook, which is what the presentations are from. So Doug will do that. We'll do a little bit of a switcheroo within each one of the authors. We'll get there 5 minutes.
All right, thanks, Jason. So some of you may have already seen this because I've done it now. This is my 4th time doing it. But hopefully at least some of this is new to some of you. So you've heard about the live handbook now because it's been in a lot of general sessions. Let me just say a little bit more about it. First, you can go to this now. It's live. You got an email about it from AEFP. There's a QR code on that little poster over there. Or you can just type in livehandbook.org into your phone and it'll pop up. So what is this thing? An online, free, open access, expert, meaning all of you, written set of summaries of education policy research. The way I think it's best to think about it is a cross between what we used to do. So this, how many of you recognize that? Not very many, so we should all feel old. You recognize that. This is the first handbook. I can't remember, I guess it's 2007. But integrating that with Wikipedia. Okay, you put those 2 things together, you get a live handbook, and you'll see why that is the case. We're covering everything from early childhood to higher education. It's really just a new way of approaching synthesis of research. I think it's why it's hard to describe. It's why I try to come up with the convictions of Wikipedia. It's really different, and it took a while to get the authors. Kudos to the authors for figuring out how to do this. This is a really different kind of writing. The audience, this is something the editorial board talked a lot about at the beginning. Normally, whenever you write anything, you think, okay, one audience, we're not going to complicate this. But it is complicated in this case, and I think we actually are reaching several audiences with this. You put policymakers first, journalists, they're at the top. But I think it's going to be useful to everybody, because you'll see when you get into it that at the top of it, it looks like a policy. Here's a finding, 1 sentence, here's a few sentences about it, on to the next finding, it's like a policy brief would be. But you can click on one of them, and it'll take you down to a longer discussion of the research. And then you can click on the endnotes, and it'll take you down to the studies underlying that discussion, so you can get as deep in the weeds of this as you want. The top of it's really about policymakers. As you go down, it becomes more about the researchers being the audience. So, multiple audiences. I want to say a little bit about the criteria and the adjectives we're using to describe it and how it affects the design. So I say it's objective. That can mean a lot of different things. What we mean by it is that you tell the authors, present different sides of the issue. This is not an essay. I'm trying to talk about different sides of issues, use the most rigorous and recent evidence. We have a wide-ranging editorial board. It's not even just AEFP. You'll see this here in a second. Comprehensive, I already mentioned that we're covering early childhood through higher ed, but it's also going to be adding over time. So this is not done. This is just the start of the live handbook. So we've got 50 chapters in it, 50 for 50. The idea is to add 20 or 25 every year, so it builds out into something actually comprehensive. It's not comprehensive yet, but the idea is that it will. And that it will be timely. So one of the other interesting features is we're going to ask everybody to look at their pieces, all the authors, once a year. There's a feedback feature, so people can go in, so there are going to be comments on these through the online system, and that's all going to be sent to the authors once a year, and we'll ask them to respond to feedback. Some of the authors are like, wait a second. I told you this. You just forgot. And so that's the sense in which it's timely. So if a new study comes out, we can update it as fast as the authors are willing to. And useful, so written for a broad audience, open access, no registration, you just go to the site and you can start playing. So that's the design. This is the editorial board. It's been fantastic. Many of them are here. I'm not going to do it by name, but you probably recognize many of these names. I also want to call out Mato Morales, who's here in the back. Mato, raise your hand. So Mato's been, he's the managing editor, has been doing a lot of the legwork trying to translate all of the Word documents that people are sending into what you see in the website. So he's been critical. I want to thank a few groups, the editorial board, the AEFP leadership for agreeing to do this and having faith in this project. Mato and the interns, we have a whole army of Chilean interns who have been also contributing to this. Funders, William T. Grant Foundation, Smith Richardson. You won't see Smith Richardson's name on anything because they don't want to be publicly named, but I can be allowed me to put the name on for these purposes. Tulane also kicking in some funding for it. And there's one final group that I want to thank, and that's IES. Right, so everybody knows what's happening with IES, but let's just think about what's in the handbook when you start searching. Almost every, I would say literally every chapter has some IES roots in it. Right? IES creates the data, IES funds a lot of the research, and IES funds programs, postdoc programs. A lot of the authors of the articles are coming from that. So this thing is really a monument to IES. I can't imagine what this would look like if IES were around and never been around. I'm trying to think about that. It would look very different. I'm not even sure it would have come up with the idea because there wouldn't have been enough to write about it. So even though nobody's here from IES for obvious reasons, but let's give them a round of applause. Last but not least, just how you can help with this. So we want to get it out there. So share it on social media and email and to people you think would be interested in it. Make recommendations for topics and authors. So we're going to expand it over time. Self-nominations are welcome. I'm also looking to some of the flash talks. I think are actually not live handbook chapters. Most of them are, but not all. So I'm looking for new ones to add in. Also looking for other funding sources. There is some cost to the whole enterprise, even though everybody's volunteering. The editorial board, the authors is all volunteer, but there's the copy editor, the website and stuff that all occurs. So spread the word and let's have a great session.
Thanks.
All right. Good. Okay, so all the presentations I put into one PDF because they were all like different shapes and sizes and different formats and so forth. So apologies to the authors if they lost anything in the translation. That will be my fault, not their fault. We'll take responsibility for it. That will save us the time of switching back and forth. There we go. Okay, so there'll be 9 of these, and I think my understanding is this is the 4th of these that people have sort of found that it works best to let's just do them all, and then we'll have like Q&A at the end. So my advice is if you have questions about the chapters as we go, like write them down, all right? Because we'll all still be here. There's only 9. We can make it, all right? And so we're just gonna power through them one after another. I'm gonna keep time. Everybody has pretty strict instructions about what the format is and the timing. And I think this will be interesting and engaging, and it should be a lot of fun. So write your questions down, and we'll do Q&A at the end. All right. Here we go.
Hello everyone, I'm Haeryun Kim, the 3rd-year PhD student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And first of all, I'm very honored to present here, but honestly, on the other hand, I'm very nervous, because I see a lot of amazing scholars that are listed as my next presenters. And I see them in the textbook from the course I've taken, in the papers I'm studying for my exam. So I'm very nervous, but I really appreciate this opportunity, so I'll do my best to make a great start to this session. Yeah, so thank you very much, and I'm going to talk about some knowns and unknowns of school hiring committees. And actually, this is not a part of the handbook, so my goal of this presentation is to briefly introduce what kind of evidence exists in this topic that can guide the future research on this one. So let's dive into the topic. So far, many previous studies have shown that how schools screen and hire candidates vary a lot across the context. Some research focused on the district level hiring practices, and others focused on exploring the experiences of individual school principals' decision. And all of them show that there is a big variation in hiring practices, and almost like this arrow. And within this spectrum, I'm going to focus on the use of school hiring committee, which seems to be located in the middle of this arrow because it is a kind of a shared decision-making process that is not too focused on either of these two. And basically, it aims to facilitate collaborative endeavor in hiring by involving multiple stakeholders like current teachers, principals, or parents, even though the composition depends a lot on the context. So, Actually, there are relatively few studies that examine this topic, but based on the previous literature, I could draw two big ideas. The first one is that hiring committees seem to make the hiring practices more effective by offering more time for principals to observe candidates and also increasing chances of better evaluating a candidate's soft skill, which is very hard to be objective in evaluating. And also, another study shows that it increases the chances to find a better fit candidate. However, this is not always the case because according to one study, it shows that sometimes committee members are skeptical about their ability to evaluate the candidate well. And also, some cases, hired candidates who were considered as best at the moment of the interview are turned out to be not that good at the end, not living up to their expectations. And the second idea is that the degree of collaboration among the hiring committee members seem to vary a lot. That particularly at the level, depending on the two factors. The first one is a grade level. The high school principals are likely to collaborate more with the teachers from particular subject than elementary school principals. And second, depending on the stage of the hiring process, the collaboration differs a lot as well. For example, some principals highly rely on the committee's decision at the end of the final decision. However, some other principals really try to accept only portion of the committee's final decision. However, on the other hand, in some cases, principals really like to have the ultimate power to veto the decision, and even in some cases, they really restart the entire hiring process if there is no candidate they really want to hire. So, as I mentioned, there is a big need to collect more evidence on this topic, but at least based on the previous literature, I can say that school hiring committees seem like a good strategy, or at least can be a good strategy in mitigating potential biases in hiring, because it is better than just relying one or two influential individuals in selecting the finalists. And also, second, it might be effective to create collaborative spaces to provide some environment to discuss about what kind of candidate will align with our unique need and context. However, as I mentioned, there are many aspects that are understudied about the operation of school hiring committees. So these following questions might help to guide the future studies, but they're very rough and superficial at this moment. For example, we can think about that we know that hiring committees happen, but we do not exactly know how often it happens and also how they function. So we can think about this one as well. For example, we can think of how the committee members are selected to work as a committee member. And also, we can think of what kind of operational process they follow while the hiring committees are operated. And second, we might be curious about whether it is really helpful to improve the hiring practices. Particularly, we can think of the question like, do candidates who rank high with high intermediate agreement are really the best, even after they started their job at the end? So, that's all for me. I'm also very
She modeled staying well under the time, so the rest of you. All right, Anna six.
Hi everyone, my name is Anna Moyer and I'm here to convince you that assistant principals are fascinating subjects that you should add to the research base. So I'm here to talk about APs. APs are a growing part of the educator workforce, but we really don't know much about them as a field. This is in the AP Lab Handbook with Ellen, Mariesa, and Mollie. Please check it out. Please help us add to it. So, APs. Over the last 30 years, the number of APs has drastically increased, and it has outpaced the number of students and the number of schools in the country. We don't really know why this is the case, but we think schools are trying to add capacity because of policy that is happening around them. In 1990, about 35% of schools had at least one AP. In 2020, that number was 60%, and this is driven by the dramatic increase in APs at the elementary level. APs are also more racially diverse than the teaching workforce that they tend to come from, and the principal workforce that they tend to move into. We do not have national data about the demographics of APs, so we look to state studies. Some of these studies are a little older, but more recent studies continue to find that APs tend to be about a quarter people of color, compared to teachers that are about 13% people of color and principals that are about 20% people of color. So if we want to diversify the principal workforce, one place to look is APs. In the chapter, those are 2 findings that we find. Some more key findings, along with that increase in the number of APs, we also see that principals are more likely to have had past AP experience. About half of principals report that they were APs in the past, and 80% now report that they have AP experience. That really highlights this AP role as a stepping stone into the principalship. When people want to become principals, they tend to move into pre-service programs where they do not specifically get training about being an AP, but they move into the AP role and then they move into the principalship about 3 to 5 years later based on the research we have. APs take on a lot of on-the-job training that helps them become better principals. They have professional development, but it's not equally distributed. APs in smaller schools, APs in rural schools tend to report less, and we don't really know what effective training for APs looks like. Another place you can study. And I hope this is the take-home point that you hear, there's really limited research about how much APs contribute to student success and school improvement. We could use a lot more of that, though it is challenging to enforce. There are a lot of policy implications that we talk about in considerations. I'm going to walk you through 4 buckets. These are all on our online chapter. So the first is that licensure standards and evaluations tends to be the same for principals and APs, national standards, state evaluations. So we recommend this idea that people could start to break them apart. We see that in some districts where APs have different standards and different evaluations than principals. The AP rule is heavily influenced by policy. For example, having to evaluate teachers, which has become a norm across many states twice a year or even more, tends to fall on principals who then delegate that to APs and has changed the role in the last 20 years pretty substantially. Articulating the job, better understanding the job, having PD focused on that AP role, but also thinking about moving to the principalship is one way that districts can consider supporting APs. Allocation tends to be set by states, but sometimes it's set by districts. And again, I say if we had more knowledge about how this impacted students, we could allocate APs in ways that might improve schools. And then finally, the stepping stone to the principalship role. Some districts have formal pathways for APs, some are less formal, but thinking about how we can tighten those up and help people move into the principalship as we continue to diversify that role from this role, which is more diverse than the others, is an important policy thing that we should take into consideration. So, in conclusion, what you will see in our chapter is that the evidence is sparse and we have more questions than answers. And so if you are looking for a place to, a topic to study, where you can make a difference, where there are many, many questions, please take a look at the handbook chapter and help us try to answer them.
Hi, Dan Goldhaber from Calder and the University of Washington. Talking about licensure, I suspect this, I don't need to say much. 3 minutes and 1 minute? No, right, but it's 3 minutes and 1 minute are the warnings? Okay, all
I
right.
can show you the 5.
Yeah, no. I still have 5 minutes left. I suspect I don't need this first bullet, but let me just say what licensure is. This licensure is a state function, so it is the state trying to guarantee a minimum level of quality of teachers. And I think conceptually you might say, why not leave this up to localities since they're the ones closest to making the decision? But if you look back at history at the reason for licensure, there were some reasons to think that localities didn't always make the right decisions. You might think about like the football coach who gets to be the math teacher kind of thing. Licensure generally entails some kind of pedagogical training, clinical practice, i.e. student teaching, passing one or more licensure tests. And I think most people think about licensure in connection to just the licensure tests, but it really is all of these things. It's controversial because you're limiting the choices that localities have. And in particular, because of the licensure tests, we know, have a real adverse impact on the options amongst who is selected. So individuals of color are less likely to pass licensure tests. So it runs counter, the licensure tests run counter to diversifying the teacher workforce. I think it's important to know that there are always going to be type 1 and type 2 errors that are going to occur whenever you have a system like this. There are going to be people who would have made for effective teachers, had they been granted entry, but they don't get granted entry, and there's some people who aren't going to do very well on who pass the requirements, but don't turn out to be particularly good teachers. I think it's really hard to know much about licensure as a thing, and whether that thing has an impact on the quality of the teacher workforce, because you are potentially impacting multiple points along the early teacher pipeline, and we don't always observe, or we mostly don't observe, a lot of the counterfactuals. So I'll maybe come back to this in a minute. We know a lot more, I would say, about the connection between licensure tests and in-service teacher effectiveness and performance. All right, licensure tests tend to be I would say, tend to be positively correlated with future teacher value added. But licensure tests, there are many different tests, different subjects, different grade levels, tests that are for pedagogy, tests that are for basic skills, and the relationship between those tests really varies. So there are some licensure tests that I would argue have almost no predictive validity in terms of the value added of teachers, and then there are some that have a lot more predictive validity. I think when you look at the literature as a whole, that it tends to be the more math, science, higher grade levels, that there's a stronger relationship. And when you're looking at like the licensure tests for early elementary school teachers, you really don't see much of a relationship between the performance of the test and student achievement. There are some other things that states have tried. NTPA is one of them. It's like a portfolio-based assessment. There are only a very limited number of studies connecting that kind of assessment to future teacher or student performance. And there's really very little evidence connecting any licensure components to non-value added measures of teachers. And I think that's important because there's new literature on the importance of non-value added. Okay, I already said that it changes the supply and the composition of the teacher workforce. There's limited cross-state mobility of teachers who are teaching with experience in one state to another state. Maybe that is connected to licensure tests, but it could be other things as well. Okay. Policy considerations. I think it's important to get the counterfactuals right, because if we think that we ought to do away with licensure tests or any other components of licensure, it's important to think about, like, do we even think that there should be a state role? And if it's not this component, what do we want to guarantee a minimal level of quality? And sometimes in policy debates, I don't see people sort of thinking about it that way. I think it's important, from my perspective, to think about improving systems, maybe, instead of thinking about it as up or down, eliminate them. And I will leave it at that. Okay. I am not Cyrus Grout, but I'm standing in for Cyrus Grout. So Cyrus wrote the handbook chapter. My friends will sometimes say that Dan likes to be as surprised as the audience when the next slide comes up. So these are Cyrus's slides, so it's a little bit true in this case that I'll be as surprised as you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about teacher hiring and selection. And if you look at the labor economics and personnel literatures, there's the potential that there's some really important things about the hiring and selection processes from the broader labor economics to suggest that we ought to be looking carefully at this in terms of teacher quality. I think that there are good reasons that we should be especially concerned in public education. There's a lot of evidence that teachers vary in terms of their impacts on students, and so the quality of teachers really matters when we're thinking about student outcomes. It's arguably really difficult to remove teachers that are seen to be ineffective once they're already in service. And then finally, if you look at the distribution of teachers across students, it is the newest teachers that tend to be teaching the most disadvantaged students. So when we think about hiring, we think it's especially consequential for some of the students that really most need high-quality teachers. There's actually a lot of control that school systems have outside of some constraints. I've already just talked about the licensure system, but local school systems have a lot of discretion over, like, you know, where are we going for recruitment, what kind of information is collected about prospective candidates, what is our process. So some school systems have a central HR process for teacher processing. Some school systems, you know, are decentralized and leave it more up to individual schools. I don't think we know much systematically in this country about these different kinds of processes. There's some evidence I'll talk about in a second that protocols, the sort of screening protocols really matter. There's some new evidence about the timing of job postings and the connection to teacher quality. All right, I've already said this. There is generally a weak relationship between the supply of prospective teachers and teacher effectiveness. And I'm mostly thinking of one very good study from the Boston school system. So this is Jesselyn James, Matt Kraft, and others. So I recommend that study, but it also shows that I'm thinking of one study that there's a lot of room for research in this area. But the fact that there is a weak relationship between the supply of candidates and teacher effectiveness suggests that there's a lot of scope for improvement in the process. Evidence from like selected school districts suggests that hiring often occurs late and is information poor. But again, I think that we don't know much systematically about that. We know some information about what principals prefer about teachers, and some of it is like the characteristics, like how they express themselves, experience. I'd recommend Doug's article from way back when. And then there are some systems school systems, where we've gotten information about screening protocols and ratings of teacher applicants. And those screening protocols and ratings have then been connected to in-service teacher outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think the evidence from the screening protocol rating of applicants connected to the teacher outcomes suggests that the information that you can collect amongst the teacher applicants can be productive for looking at teacher quality. You get information from teacher applicants that's useful in doing these predictions. Arguably somewhat weak, but that's true for anything before you observe somebody who's teaching. Late hiring is common. Let's see what else. This last point here is about late hiring, and it's also from the Boston study where there was a change to try to move the timelines up. But again, I'm referencing just a single study here that investigates this really important issue. So my bottom line on this topic is there's a lot of room to do a lot of good research that's very, very practical for school systems.
Paul is following a double dose of animal.
I'm only presenting one, I think. Hi, I'm Paul Bruno, assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And I had the privilege of writing the live handbook chapter on teacher supply and turnover. And I will just say, as someone who's like an instructor in a lot of these, like covers a lot of these topics, I've already flagged a number of these chapters as like they're going right into the syllabus, replacing stuff like there's some nods. Like a lot of this is like stuff I wish had been written before when I was making my syllabi, and it looks super sharp. So all of which is to say, if you haven't checked it out, I think check it out. There's a ton of good stuff in there. As sort of background and context here, I'll just say why do they want this chapter? Teachers are important. I won't say a lot more about that than that. If you're like, man, I don't know about teachers, you can say that for the Q&A. as a result, there's these long-standing, widespread concerns about the supply of teachers. Lots of concerns here related to the production rate, retention of teachers, the quality of teachers, how they're distributed among students, for example. And this is a pretty broad topic, and so I was asked to identify, I was told, no more than 6 sort of key findings on this very broad topic, so I exercised some judgment where I thought the evidence was strong and the importance high of some sort of stylized facts about teacher supply and turnover, which I'll run through briefly here. So first, the number of teachers working in schools has increased substantially over time and much faster than the number of students. This is true both recently and at least qualitatively over a series of decades. Arguably a sense of gives some indication of the sort of the robustness of the teacher supply in some general sense. At the same time, the rate at which people pursue teaching licenses has declined somewhat from a recent peak around 2010. I think it's a little less clear in the last couple of years exactly what's happening, but I think qualitatively that sort of points potentially in a slightly different direction than fact number 1 up here. Item number 3, teacher shortage rates are low on average. So for example, most of the recent studies looking at this tend to find teacher vacancy rates between 1% and 4%. Thanks. Haeryun said I could have some of her time. Teacher vacancy rates generally hover in recent years between like 1% and 4%, which I think is arguably low in absolute terms. It's also low compared to what we see in the economy as a whole. On the other hand, there's a lot of variation here. Those vacancies, those shortages, however you measure them, heavily concentrated in certain schools, certain types of teaching positions affecting certain groups of students. Typically, 5 to 8% of teachers approximately leave the profession each year. That fluctuates, for example, with economic conditions. Again, that looks similar to, maybe slightly lower than, rates for other sort of comparable workers, depending on how you define that. Teacher turnover, though, people care about this because teacher turnover disrupts school operations, harms student outcomes. That appears to be true over and above the effects of just changing out more veteran teachers for newer teachers, for example. And there's pretty good evidence from a variety of studies across contexts that higher compensation tends to increase teacher recruitment and retention. Implications, maybe I'll editorialize a bit, go a little bit beyond exactly what I think the evidence suggests, is I would say one implication here is that a lot of the concerns about the teacher supply are likely overblown to some extent, like when you hear about sort of catastrophic nationwide teacher shortages. At a minimum, I think it's safe to say those discussions often lack the nuance that you need to properly inform the policy discussion. At the same time, the costs of a weak teacher supply are disproportionately borne by the already marginalized students in the educational system. So we need to be worried about those in particular. I think there's a good case to be made that compensation is maybe underused as a tool to improve the teacher supply. Just when I think about the difference between how much evidence there is that compensation can be used strategically to improve the teacher supply and the extent to which it is actually used to impact the teacher supply, particularly within districts, I would say. And I think there's a lot of important things we don't know about the teacher supply, but that are deserving of additional study. So, for example, I pulled out a few of those here. I've got them sort of laid out in the chapter briefly. First, I think we don't know much about the quality of the teacher supply, or how to trade off quantity and quality, right? A lot of what I've talked about here is about the numbers, the size, not the quality, and I think there are potentially important trade-offs between quantity and quality in the teacher supply. I think we need more evidence about non-compensation interventions to improve the quantity, quality, and diversity of the teacher supply. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that in some sense working conditions matter for teachers. I think it's not as obvious as in the case of compensation how to operationalize that and how to intervene to improve those working conditions to get the teacher supply effects that we want. And I think we could use more information about the earliest stages of like the teacher pipeline, not like college graduation, teacher certification, what happens to novice teachers, but what do people choose to pursue when they're leaving high school, going into college, what are they interested in studying? I think there's some evidence suggesting that those are actually some of the important decision points for things like teacher diversity, for example, but it's also where the information that we have is weakest, thinnest, and most limited. All right, I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Paying attention to the schedule. Hi, I'm Eric Taylor. My job is to talk about teacher evaluation. Teachers work for schools, right? And in that employment relationship, teacher evaluation is sort of fundamental. This is not a chapter about the race to the top or the Obama administration, though during that period there was a lot of innovation and a lot of top-down policy sort of choices about teacher evaluation, but teacher evaluation has existed for generations before the Obama administration, and will exist for generations after, because it is fundamental. Why is it fundamental? When teacher evaluation of any employee is a set of decisions about how are we going to measure someone's performance, what judgments are we going to make about whether that performance is good or bad, what incentives are we going to attach to our judgments about their performance. And so if in the absence of formal policies or formal measurement systems, local school principals are going to have to make decisions on their own, and that might affect teachers' careers in ways that we like or don't like. So the chapter in the handbook includes lots of evidence from the United States and elsewhere. I have 5 minutes or less than 5 minutes at this point to talk to you today. And so I just want to emphasize one thing that I've noticed over the last long time thinking about teacher evaluation, and that is I've tried to sort of listen to policymakers and researchers talk about teacher evaluation. And here's sort of my summary of the two policy camps, right? You can think of them as like different rationales for teacher evaluation. You can think about them as design guides, the ways people try to think about how are we going to design an evaluation system. On the one side is what we can think of as sort of the rewards and effort camp. And if you talk to this group, they'll say, look, we'll measure performance, we'll attach some reward to that performance, and as a result of attaching that reward, we'll get people to change what they do, to expend more calories or to make different decisions at work. This emphasizes the extrinsic motives of evaluation, and we expect that the changes to be temporary. Why? Because they're coinciding with the rewards. If you're not rewarding me for doing what you want me to do, then I'll stop doing it once the rewards go away. The other camp we could sort of think about as the feedback and skills camp, right? We're still going to measure performance, but we're going to focus on the feedback that's generated by that evaluation. And this camp says if we do that, if we focus on the feedback, we'll get skill growth, because what teachers need is information about how to improve. More optimistically, we might expect there to be a lasting improvement in performance because skills last. And this camp emphasizes the intrinsic motives of teachers. And you know, some of you in this room will know that like sometimes talking to these two sort of policy camps feels a bit like the Montagues and the Capulets, right? Like they think they hate each other, they're not really sure why, but it's been a long time, and they think that their perspectives on this important policy issue are sort of diametrically opposed. But I don't think that's the case, right? And I think the more research evidence we have testing some of these ideas, the sort of more we see overlap between these perspectives. So one way to think about that is just to ask ourselves a fundamental question. When do teachers invest in their skills, right? So if we're thinking about the sort of skills growth camp, when do teachers invest in skills? Well, those of us in the room who are trained in economics say they invest when the return is greater than the cost. How does evaluation change the returns and costs? Well, measures and feedback reduce the cost of skill investments. But also performance incentives create an increased return on that investment, right? So extrinsic rewards for performance can generate investments in skills. So maybe there's a third camp here, rewards and skills, where performance measures and rewards themselves contribute to lasting improvements through skill growth. And I'm at the end of the 5 minutes, so what I'll just say is if you read the chapter, there's plenty of evidence that you can read as in favor of or opposed to one camp, in favor of or opposed to another camp. But hopefully as we sort of continue to test different programs and different approaches to teacher evaluation, we'll sort of figure out this landscape of what the underlying mechanisms are that give rise to improvements. So thank you, and that's it.
Hi everyone, my name is Mollie. Jason and I wrote this chapter on school leader pathways, selection, and hiring. I do not have to convince this room that school leaders matter. We happily wrote, the evidence base on how much school leaders matter for improving student, teacher, and school outcomes. We also know that hiring high-quality school leaders is a key goal for school districts. We know that exit rates of principals are quite high, and so school districts are continuously going through a selection and hiring process to fill key roles when principals do turn over. And so today I'm going to share what the current evidence base can tell us about this important topic. And we are sharing 6 key findings. The first is that states do create these formal requirements for school leader pathways, and they do it via licensure, but they also have some teaching requirements, and obviously principals need to go through accreditation programs. But we learn from the literature that not all requirements are supported by the empirical evidence. So unlike what you shared, Dan, for the school principal licensure requirement, there are 35 states that require a principal assessment. And there isn't clear evidence that those assessments actually predict later principal effectiveness. And we also know that a lot of states require about 3 to 5 years of teaching experience. So a minimal but not a long-term teaching experience does predict, is important for school year effectiveness. And our second key finding related is that just understanding what a typical pathway is for school principals. So in general, principals, they obtain a master's degree from a university-based prep program. Then they work as an assistant principal, which we learned is more frequent. But we learned that there's a big gap between the number of, like a multi-year gap, between when a principal gets credentialed and when they actually become a principal candidate. Key finding 3 is that districts are increasingly building their own. So we know that the school principal labor market is also very localized, and so there have been a lot of efforts recently to create more like direct principal pipelines, and those pipeline efforts are showing promise. And then key finding 4 is that there's, this is what was exciting about your topic, there's very little evidence on school principal hiring and selection. Most of the studies are looking at the characteristics of school leaders, but those don't tell us whether some of the patterns are related to either where principal applicants are applying, or whether it's a hiring decision maker issue. And then key finding 5 is that we all know that tapping is still a relatively important part of the pathway. It happens quite often. However, we also all know that this pathway is subject to in-group biases, and it's really non-selective. So lastly, there are some race, ethnicity, and gender gaps along the pipeline. Principals of color have also lower rates of passing principal licensure assessments. And they also wait longer after getting their degree, before they get an AP position or a principal position. And also, women continue to be underrepresented in the principalship, but these gaps are narrowing. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. And so here, what are the policy implications here? So the first one is that, states actually may want to revisit the licensure assessments. Like I said, they're not good predictors of principals' later effectiveness, and they actually may constrain the pool of potential candidates, especially for leaders of color. We are learning more and more that experience as an AP is an important training ground for new principals, and so school districts could be more intentional about providing leadership and growth opportunities during those years as an AP. Cities and districts also, given the good evidence for investing in homegrown leadership pipelines, cities and districts may want to make more of an investment to create a clear pathway for principals in their communities. And then we all know that tapping is, like I said earlier, it's an informal mechanism, but because it is subject to in-group biases, we should maybe think about more of a formalized process for helping to identify high-quality principal candidates. And then lastly, more research is needed. So it was exciting to see on hiring and selection, school leaders overall, and especially targeted research for why fewer women may be applying for principal roles and being selected in principal roles. Thank you.
I'm going to pivot a little bit. My name is Anna Markowitz, and along with my friend and colleague, Daphne Basak, I work the chapter on the early care and education workforce. So the big difference from K-12, whereas in the K-12 setting, about 95% of kids, give or take, attend the public school system, kids from age 0 to 5 are served in a wide array of settings that have various goals, various funding streams, and different oversight. And this is really has to do sort of with historical view of this as women's work, is not important, it's not educational, which is not true, and I'd be happy to fight on that point with anyone who wants to. But so they're served in home-based or family childcare, center-based childcare, Head Start, and state and local public pre-kindergarten are sort of the 4 largest sectors. But all 4 of these sectors can and do receive public dollars. Specifically, home-based and family childcare and center-based childcare receive public dollars through the childcare subsidy system. So they are sort of all places where kids are receiving public funds to get educated. Now, the fact that they're going to these very different settings with very different funding and very different regulations belies the fact that children across settings just need good teachers. And they are growing and developing at a rate from birth to 5 that they will never again develop at for the rest of their lives. One of the most important brain synaptic growth and pruning is occurring during this time period, and they're learning that foundational sort of set of skills that's going to serve them downstream. So teachers, very important for kids in this time period. I want to flag also that teachers are very important for parents during this time period who need a place to work. Anybody with a small one in the room knows what I'm talking about. So, key findings about this workforce. Entry requirements, professional sports, and compensation are far lower for these educators than their peers working with older children. Just to give one example, whereas almost the entire K-12 teacher workforce has a bachelor's degree and certification, as we've heard, only 35% of the early childhood workforce has a bachelor's degree. And in fact, there is no sort of universal entry requirement for entering the early childhood workforce, except that you need to pass a background check. That's it. This discrepancy between K-12 and early education is really big and a problem, etc. But it also sort of masks the fact that there's huge variability across these sectors that I've just brought up. And in fact, the sectors that serve the most children, so that center-based childcare sector and the home-based childcare sector, face the most challenging working conditions. And this is in terms of compensation, professional supports, and entry requirements. What do I mean when I say low compensation? Because we all care about how much teachers get paid. On average, childcare workers make about half of what their K-12 peers make. If you use the MIT living wage calculator, the median childcare wage in every state is far below the living wage for a single person with no children. In most cases, it's half or less than a living wage. And I work in states where folks are working the federal minimum wage. For those of you keeping track at home, that's $7.25 an hour. Is low. Folks working in childcare also often do not have consistent access to professional supports or a leader who necessarily has been trained in child development pedagogy. This, of course, has implications. Turnover is extremely high. When I say turnover is high, sorry, Paul, we're looking at 30 to 40% turnover annually. This is using some longitudinal data from Virginia. And in fact, the other really concerning thing is that when these folks leave, they largely leave the workforce altogether. So they're not switching to another, these are private businesses. You might think, oh, we're just popping to another center. That's not what's happening here, they're leaving. And even in school-based pre-K, which is more resourced, we see turnover rates of about 25%, so quite high. This, of course, matters for children, for families, and for site stability. So policy solutions, well, there is some evidence that increased compensation will stabilize the workforce, but there's little evidence on that for quality or child outcomes. There's also limited evidence on the impact of education requirements on retention, quality, and child outcomes, so people think about that a lot for obvious reasons, because we have this sort of low bar to entry. And this is really because of the absence of data systems. So exactly what we're all sort of worried about with the loss of IES, this is the case in early childhood and has been for a long time. So we just don't simply know about early childhood, what you all have been talking about here. And you know, folks are now putting the effort to build that on the state side, but it's a long time coming and it's an area of underinvestment. The last thing I'd say is that the loss of federal funding via Head Start and the child care subsidy programming, so like a lot more of early childhood is funded at the federal level, and losing that could have serious destabilizing impacts. And here I'm thinking, for example, during COVID, when they basically tried to respond to the loss of spots by basically making it so anybody can teach under any setting, and hoping that doesn't happen. Oh, thanks.
Yep, it is me. All right. Hi everyone, my name is Logan McDermott. I'm a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. Shout out to my co-authors, Andrea Ochoa and Dr. Rebecca Cruz. Importantly, similar to Haeryun, I'm not a part of the handbook, and actually I'm presenting a study, and so this is going to be real quick in 5 minutes, but the study is called How is School Composition Associated with Paraprofessional Staffing? A National Analysis. So first, as a piece of background, what is a paraprofessional? We have talked about so many different people today that are involved in schools and in classrooms. Paraprofessionals are a little bit different in that they go by a lot of titles. You may call them teachers' aides, you may call them paraeducators, assistant teachers. There's so many different labels they have, but essentially it is somebody who is not a teacher but is working to support teachers. They're allowed to do a lot of things. Sometimes they're helping with behavior management. They're even in very limited circumstances allowed to teach, so long as they are not the ones primarily preparing the materials, and they're heavily supported by and monitored by the certified teachers. So one thing that we really wanted to understand is who is working with paraprofessionals. That's kind of what started all of this, is that we know they often work with students labeled in special education, often working with students that are labeled as emerging multilingual learners. But we really wanted to understand, is there a relationship in types of schools that they're working with? So we wanted to look at these 3 research questions. So is there a relationship between school composition and the paraprofessional to student ratio? Also the same thing about racial composition within students that are already labeled in special education. So for example, what is the percentage of your students with IEPs that are Black? And then we also looked at district level racial diversity as well. To conduct this study, we used the Civil Rights Data Collection. We used the 2017-2018 data because that is the most recent data set that has all of the variables we need. The more recent data set does not have some of these variables. And in this data set, we used HLM. We wanted to see how schools were nested in districts, because this is all school level data. So to go to our key findings, and this is pretty small, but I really wanted to, rather than put all the output up, I just want to show you these coefficient plots. So this one right here is for school demographic variables. So this line in the middle would be 0, would be a 0 coefficient. Anything positive means that an increase in the percentage of that group in your school results in a higher paraprofessional to student ratio. Anything negative would be the opposite effect. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to this side so I can point better. Percentage students with an IEP, we are not surprised to see that as you have a higher percentage of students with an IEP, you have more paraprofessionals per student working in your school. Same with students that are labeled as English language learners. We also see some racial, so you see that for Latinx students, it is a negative ratio, a negative relationship. Same for the percentage of students in your school that are Asian. And for a percentage of students that are Black or multiracial, you see a higher paraprofessional to student ratio. Interestingly, you see a reverse of some of these relationships when we're looking at the percentage of students with an IEP. So while we just said that the percentage of Black students in a school relates to a higher relationship, if you have a higher percentage of students with an IEP that are Black, you actually have a statistically significant negative relationship. Similarly, the percentage of Asian students is negative, but as a higher percentage of your students with an IEP are Asian, you see a higher coefficient and a higher ratio of paraprofessionals to students. At the district level, you also see some reversing. So as you have a higher percentage of students with an IEP in your district, that is a negative relationship. Similarly, there are no positive relationships at the district level. So what does all this mean? What are our policy implications? So there is a relationship that we can see from this data between school and district demographics and the paraprofessional to student ratio. These numbers and coefficients are really small, but this is because we're talking about percentages and ratios. So just to give an example, for black students, the coefficient is 0.0000482, which sounds really small, but what that practically means is for each additional 10% of black students in a school, this is associated with an additional 1 para per 2,300 students. Schools are large, and also we know that schools are extremely racially stratified in this country. So what that would mean is that a school that is 100% black students, it's now associated with 1 per 230 students. So when you start thinking about the magnitude of the size of schools, and again, these relationships, there's definitely something that we want to look at in considering where our paraprofessionals working. One thing we cannot necessarily analyze with this data is the efficacy of paraprofessionals, or even exactly who they are working with within these schools. But once we understand that there is a relationship, it leads to a lot more questions about how are we deciding which schools should have paraprofessionals, how are they being placed, and what role they're playing in inclusion, in particular for students of marginalized and labeled groups. Thank you.
All right. I feel like I learned something. So we have a good amount of time, I think, for some questions that hopefully you were writing down. We have even more people than when we started. So we'll just, I guess I'll stand here so I can moderate, but yes, right back there.
For the chapter on APs, and I have no idea where the author is, thank you. I'm wondering if you include any questions or findings with regard to cost effectiveness, because of course there are trade-offs or opportunity costs whether a school will hire an AP versus all of the other things that they do with money.
I cannot think of any studies in the chapter that do that, and if you have them, you can comment and let us know and we will add them.
Eric, I wonder if you could comment on the degree to which it is important for there to be differentiation of the evaluations in order to have a connection with either of the mechanisms.
What kind of differentiation?
That not all teachers are rated the same.
So you have in mind, you're thinking about maybe, Dan, this like result that like if you look at the end of year 1 to 4 evaluations for many teachers, like often it's the case that like, I don't know, 60% get a 4 and 20% get a 3 or something like that. Most people get a 3 or a 4. This is
It's the widget effect, and the widget effect revisited.
Yeah. So in the chapter I show some empirical data. It turns out that like that is true of the final thing that goes inside somebody's personnel file, but it is not true if we're thinking about the sort of variation in information generated by the evaluation process. So if you just take like a system that's measuring, a couple of dozen things in classroom observations, if you take the average across the scores from all the visits and all the item level data, you get a nice Gaussian distribution of scores. It's truncated at the top, but there's plenty of information getting generated, to say nothing of the conversations that are happening between evaluators and teachers. And I think those things are the opportunity for growth and improvement. If we only had that final sheet of paper that went in someone's personnel file, why would this help anybody, right?
Eric, can I ask another question?
Sure.
I guess. One thing that I noticed, and I kind of like that dichotomy, but not really a dichotomy of incentives versus growth. I guess one thing that you didn't talk about there at all is like the screening component to evaluation, and I'm curious whether that's like 5 minutes isn't long, or whether that's kind of how you and others are thinking about it now.
5 minutes isn't long. There's 2 sections in the chapter on both like selection from the perspective of the school system and then a separate section on selection by individual teachers in response to a sort of, to use the jargon, a sort of Roy model of like, now I have to decide whether I'm going to be a teacher or not. Yeah.
And I guess I was just curious. I mean, one's like in the chapter, I said to look at it, but just kind of from your perspective, are we changing the way we're thinking about that or not?
No, we're not changing the way we're thinking about it, at least in the United States. Like nobody seems to be really that interested in selecting teachers based on performance. Some notable sort of small examples to the contrary. Outside of the United States, there's interesting research going on sort of like the teacher self-selection into teaching as a result of performance evaluation. The upshot is, if you're selecting brand new teachers based on an evaluation system, probably there may be no benefit because they don't know how they're going to do as a teacher, but experienced teachers, some opportunity.
Question about in the AP study, I think there was a bullet point that said that leadership prep programs aren't doing a good enough job of preparing pre-service leaders specifically for the AP position.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, what might that look like? Well, what do we need to be doing differently to prepare people to become APs that we're not already doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. The finding there is that they're mostly focused on the principal shift. Some individual programs, of course, might be doing that. We don't have any evidence about what that might look like and how it would be effective. I think a big part of answering that question is defining the role. And so if you're like a kind of a rational person, you might say, so if we start with the standards, then we could shape what that looks like for the prep programs, or we could define the role in other ways by observing what they're doing and having more studies of the tasks they're doing at the time. But we don't have evidence, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the answer is we don't know. And it's a great question, and you should study it.
I also have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
We're back. So one thing, in our work in early childhood, we're seeing that early childhood teachers that are working in schools report that their assistant principal is actually the person that's in charge of them, and then you're showing this data on the sharp uptake in elementary, and I'm wondering if that is really driven by pre-K programs coming online, and that's what the job is, and then that would be related to the preparation, or is that just anecdotal and not borne out, or do we not know?
I do know, personally and anecdotally, that is happening in many schools in the country and in Virginia in particular. We do not know if that's the answer, but it's a really good hypothesis, and you should study it. Join us. Or we should study it together.
There could be an interesting connection between the teacher or the principal pathways and the teacher turnover. Some of the data I've looked at, maybe you too, Jason, that they change principals a lot, and some schools do it for equity, and all this. And it seems like the teacher turnover rate just jumps like crazy when there's principal. I've often thought, maybe don't change principals as often if that's going to happen. But yeah. So it's really interesting how those things sort of fit together. The whole idea of how you deploy principles, like the military thinks about its people over time, different experiences. So
there's a different chapter in the handbook that is about principal turnover that covers that. I don't know if the author wants to say anything about it.
Read the chapter. 50 more hits to the website.
There we go, right there. That's what I want to hear.
But I think that the evidence bears that out. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I get asked this a lot by when I do professional development things that are about leaders, and then I'll have a teacher, and if they're online, and I'll get a comment in the box that someone will be saying something like, well, in my school district, they just move the principals around for whatever reason, and is that a good idea? And I said, don't do that. Evidence would not support that as a
well, at the minimum, there could be a tension.
That's right. It could be good.
Like in Madison, where I live, they move principals around tactically, so there's no bad school. The principal isn't always in. So, but yeah.
As long as there's a strategy behind it.
Yeah, but still.
My sense is that often there's not a strategy more than it's just good to have movement, new environments, and so forth. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question for Logan. I thought the finding that schools that have higher % of Black students with disabilities have fewer paras, fewer students per para. Our partners in the state of Oregon were also interested in this question. We find something very similar.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but we also find that there are also more SPED teachers in those schools, and it tends to be that because Black students have more restrictive placements. I think if TC said more generally in the field, we know less about the sort of trade-offs that schools are making between different staffing profiles. So I was wondering if in your all's data, if you've looked at that by having more para, are you having less of something else in those schools?
So that's a really interesting question. So with the data set that we have, so with CRDC, we have the number of teachers, but we do not have it broken down by gen ed or sped. And so we're not able to answer that question. When we do, one variable we included was the teacher to student ratio. And we do know, interestingly, that as the teacher to student ratio goes up, so does the parent to student ratio. But we can't say what that means. So I think more what that says is that there's more staff in general, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the answer to that question. I think that's part of a limitation of this data set. But another thing too, kind of to that continued point, we also don't know, are these pairs specifically, are they SPED paraprofessionals? Are they working with gen ed students? Are they one-to-one? So there's so many questions we don't know the answer to. And I think digging more and more into those details and getting like the state level data and the district level data would be really interesting. And student level data especially, I would love to do this with student level data rather than school level.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question for Eric about evaluation. It could maybe apply to the hiring work too. I know about Matt Kraft's study in Boston because I was there, and he studied, could you help people be better givers of feedback? Principals be better givers of feedback? And the short answer is kind of, in our case, no, we did a whole lot of work and no. Have you studied capacity building reforms like that to see if we can help people be better at being evaluators or givers of feedback? And I'm also thinking about it for hiring, like what types of training there are for committees. Can you help people actually be better at this?
The study you referenced by Matt and
Jesselyn.
And
that's the only one that I'm aware of. Maybe
Yeah.
other people have.
I didn't know if there were other ones.
There's a session tomorrow morning, or maybe I can't remember when it is. Tomorrow, that is broadly about hiring, and I'll be talking about getting the people who write letters of recommendation to rate the teacher applicants, and then providing those ratings to the hiring committee.
Make them better at their decisions. Okay, great, thank you.
I have a question for Paul, which is, you said that you were editorializing a little bit, but you said, the claims that are made about teacher shortages not being at a sort of at a crisis are overblown, or at least they're lacking in nuance. And I mean, Dan has been talking about this for a long time also, that we need like a more robust understanding of what actually it means to be in a shortage context. I guess my question is, I think there is a general sense in the field that it's getting worse and worse, and post-COVID it's getting really, really bad. And I'm curious how recent our data is for being able to make the claim.
Mic one test. Hello.
That wasn't just in my head.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Mic one test. Mic one test. Check. Mic one test. Mic one test. Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
My question is, how recent is our data for us to be able to say with confidence that actually we are not reaching some kind of crisis?
So at one level, that question is to some extent impossible to answer, because what crisis means, I think, is going to be inherently subjective. I will say the specific figures I was referring to here when I say vacancy rates look like they're 1 to 4% wherever we look is post-pandemic, right? So quite recent. And I would say that it's conspicuous in my mind that is at a time when the labor market as a whole was super tight. Like, it was hard for anyone to hire people. We have pretty recent data. It's imperfect in a lot of ways, but when we have it, it's what the story tells us.
Oh, Jason, I would also say that schools don't have the ESSER money anymore. So I think that's going to have a real impact on teacher hiring.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit biased. I know I've been doing this study. We're interviewing principals about teacher hiring I've been doing it like the last 4 or 5 months. And what I hear over and over from principals is, well, I used to have 15 candidates and now I have 3. So in their mind, that is a crisis. Yeah, they have 3 people to choose from, but they used to have a lot more to choose from, right? And so yeah, it depends on what your definition really is of what you're going to call a crisis. In their minds, this is like, oh, we're about to run out of teachers, in the next couple of years. But clearly the market is shifting, but it's a question of.
I do think I say that's where I have some concerns about some of the surveys that are just sort of asking people how hard is it, right? Because I've hired people, and it really didn't matter how many applicants I got or how good they were. My position was always it'd be nice to have more better applicants, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's reflected to some extent
Sure.
in the numbers.
Yeah, that's
And to the other point that's come up elsewhere, right, is it's not obvious that even when the applicant pool is shrinking, it's not like necessarily administrators are getting much worse
Exactly.
hires,
Yeah.
or in the opposite direction, right? So I think so I do worry about the strength of the applicant pool, but I think it's at least possible that the applicant pool, even when it's shrinking, is actually not affecting the total service provision in schools very much.
No, I was gonna put a flag for another chapter about COVID, where we have a graph also, if you look at it from the perspective of turnover, where we also have several states, so we combine all the studies that have been made in a nice graph. And in terms of turnover, we didn't see an increase in the first 2 years. We did see a bigger increase in the third pandemic year, but nothing that we have not seen before. And a few states had data the fourth year, and it looked like it was improving a bit. So yes, from that perspective, we did see some increase, but not something that we have not had in the past.
And just to piggyback on one more time, the other thing I'll say, that's also a pattern you see in the broader labor market around turnover. Like, it's not obviously something unique to schools, it's reflecting this broad, I think, reflecting broader macroeconomic issues.
Eric. Dan, I want to take up your challenge, like what would we do if we're not doing the thing we do right now for licensure? So if there was a policymaker who said, I would like to grant licenses not based on a test or where you went to school, but based on your performance on the job in the first year or two, like back to Isaac's question. Like, is there any evidence that would help that policymaker think about that proposal?
I mean,
No?
do you mean evidence of places that do that? Or do you mean like, do I think that there's information that you get about teachers that are in service that could be used to inform that kind of policy?
I mean, I'm not aware of any place that does that very strongly. I mean, there nominally, it seems like there are rules about like you get something like a probationary license and then like, but is there any good research about that dimension of licensure?
I don't think so, and I think that I saw a paper recently, I think mostly the summative ratings, people don't get exited based on the summative ratings. I think that probationary teachers do get exited from schools and school systems because they are counseled out, which doesn't mean that they're counseled out of the profession, but they maybe end up in other schools. And there was a recent paper by Nat Malkus about the counseling out, and it's the first time that I'd ever seen any kind of like assessment as to like what percentage of the probationary teachers are counseled out. I want to say it was like 10 or 20. It was a higher percentage than I think I would have guessed that he sussed out. But I don't think that there are school systems that are doing that.
I'd like to make a plug for studying school leaders, because there is some evidence on teacher effectiveness in the role of principal, or you could think about APs and effectiveness in the role of principal. Of course, these are different jobs, but there is a place where you could see a little on-the-job learning and training over time.
Karen?
Yeah, so I used to work for a teacher preparation program that used to try to do something else like that, right? Like to gather information about the effectiveness of the people who were coming into the program. They had a residency year, so there actually was data on how they were operating in the classroom. And I will just say candidly that I think the struggle with this is that the same schools that hire novice teachers are schools that have staffing shortages.
Yeah.
I agree with Paul. It's a complicated, nuanced situation. Not every school has staffing shortages, but these schools did. They were bringing in resident teachers, brand new teachers, because they had staffing shortages, and they did not want to let them go. And sometimes the principals didn't want to let them go when the program was like, they're not doing so great. But yeah, it's hard, unless you have a surplus of teachers or applicants, you might be reluctant to make that choice.
I would just add, perhaps the charter sector gets a lot of folks without licenses and either keeps them or encourages them along the doorway.
I mean, one of the things that New York State is now considering is they're trying to ease the path for paraprofessionals to become teachers. And one of the things they were just highlighting at the last Board of Regents meeting was a pathway by which paraprofessionals' time in the classroom could be counted as their student teaching effectively. So I do wonder if maybe looking at, but it would be an alternative to them taking some of the licensing tests, interestingly enough. And so I wonder, and we sort of question, well, do you actually have the capacity to do these holistic experience-based assessments of what a para has actually done to have it be equivalent to the current more traditional certification paths, and we have there's a lot of questions about it, but if that path or similar things do go into place, I think that would be sort of the equivalent of what folks are describing, where someone gets hired with relatively minimal credentials and eventually works their way up to being a fully credentialed teacher.
When we're ready to wrap up, I just want more observations. So I don't know if you want to ask a question.
Paul, yeah, go ahead.
I have actually a question for Dan. I think as you were going through, and I think I heard two things that I was combining in my head. One about potential trade-offs between licensure requirements and the quantity of people who are through these type 1 and type 2 areas, but also it looks like maybe the pattern of type 1 and type, like the meaningfulness of the licensure test, for example, is maybe greater for some tests. And I think you were saying like maybe math, science, like those in the math
later
line.
grades.
Is that like the worst of all possible worlds for us to be in, where like the more meaningful tests are also the ones where I think we have more constrained supply of people, right? And like ideally we'd almost hope it was the other way, right? Where like actually am I interpreting that right?
No, I think that's right. And in fact, there are cases where like states and the testing companies will say, well, it's equally hard or easy to pass tests across different subjects, but it's pretty obvious that it is not, or at least that when you look at the probability of passing like math, a math subject test controlling for the basic skills test versus like ELA and basic skills, that it's harder to pass some of the tests where there are arguably greater shortages.
I seem to remember that there was this issue when we were thinking about teachers teaching out of field, and that sort of sounds like a scarcity issue. Is that gone away, or is there just so many nuances to this issue of what's a shortage?
No, it definitely hasn't gone away. I think that, and we do see that used sometimes as a measure. I think it's a tricky one to use some of the evidence about, because I think it's not always clear. One, to the issue of licensure, it's not always clear how much it matters whether they're certified, but they're out of field, what's the nature of their license, and things like that. I think it's also hard if you dig into some of the evidence to interpret the sort of like, if a teacher's out of field, are they out of field for everything that they're teaching, right? Or they have one out of field placement where they're like pinch hitting in a subject that's sort of like a new subject. So I think that is still an issue. I think it is a hard one to think through its seriousness for some of the reasons related to licensure, some reasons related to data, and also because I think it's the kind of thing where it's actually harder to make comparisons to other occupations, where we don't necessarily have the concept of out of field, even though I think conceptually it's a problem, like no matter what job you have, where you're being like assigned to tasks and you're like, I'm not really qualified to do this, but someone has to. And so I think it's also harder to contextualize that. So I think it's an issue we could understand more about, and that would be helpful.